The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. The alleged gunman in the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida reportedly wants to give any inheritance that he is due from his late mother's estate to the victims' families or an organization that will help the community heal, according to his attorneys yesterday. He appeared at a Broward County Circuit Court in Fort Lauderdale to determine whether he's indigent or whether he stands to collect $800,000 from his late mother's estate and other financial accounts in his name, which would mean that he is not indigent. And this is sort of a determination in terms of the legal representation that he's going to get. And it determines a couple elements of how the case against him is going to proceed. Before, it was determined that he couldn't afford his own attorney, and he was appointed a public defender. And now they're trying to figure out, well, if he has this money coming to him, then the public defender should actually be dismissed and he should be forced to hire an actual private attorney and pay that attorney. And what is being said by his current court-appointed attorney is that the alleged shooter doesn't want the money. He wants the money to go to the victims' families, and then presumably he would be indigent because he wouldn't be getting the money, and he would get to keep his court-appointed attorney. This is kind of interesting to me, Pat, because, I mean, I want to be clear. Public defenders are doing something that is very, very important, but they are not always the best attorneys in terms of the resources and training that they can provide to clients. So it's generally considered, and part of it is just being overworked and having an insane number of cases they're working on at one time. It's generally considered that having a private attorney, if you can afford one, is going to afford you a better defense than having a public defender. But it seems that he's sort of manipulating the situation to try to keep the public defender. And again, somebody who's willing to allegedly commit an act like this may not be someone who's going to think most rationally about anything, but it is an unusual situation.
Right. I do wonder why he would choose a public defender over a private defender if he can afford one, especially because it seems like the private defender would be able to offer more time to the shooter. And the guy's up against the death penalty, so you'd have to imagine he wants to keep his life to serve the rest of his sentence until he dies at an old age, but you never really know, I guess. And I think that it is an interesting choice. I wonder if it's a sign of remorse that he's showing by offering the money to the victims instead of keeping it for himself. Obviously, if he's going to live the rest of his life in prison, it's not like he can really use that money to a great extent. So I think it's an interesting story, to say the least.
There's a couple different elements that you could point to, right? One is the idea of the donation something that he came up with or something his public defender came up with? Is the idea of the donation potentially to curry favor to avoid the death penalty and maybe get life in prison? Is there someone else who has influenced him when it comes to this possibility of the donation? And then at the end of it, it's once again, if we imagine what it takes for someone to commit such a heinous act, can we really apply sort of what our logic would be to what they are doing? I don't really know that we can.
Right, and Nicholas Cruz, the shooter, did seem to be a little bit remorseful the day of the shooting. Even if you just watch like his arraignment and taking a look at the footage, he did seem a little bit sad about it, which is interesting because obviously the decision to go on a shooting spree at a school wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. I'm sure he planned it for a long time. And after the shooting, many of the students at Parkland said that they suspected it was Cruz because he just exhibited signs of that for many years. But I guess, after committing the shooting, maybe he did have a change of heart because then you're actually seeing the ramifications of your actions. So I think he could have, had a change. Obviously, he has to pay a penalty for it. And I think that that penalty should be serving the rest of his life in prison. That's probably going to be the result, regardless of if he has a public defender or a private defender, but maybe he will get that death penalty. It is Florida, after all.
What you're saying about maybe regretting what he is accused of doing right after the shooting is interesting. We know that with a lot of these premeditated actions that often connect to sort of emotional disturbance, including suicide attempts, that it's very common, for example, with suicide attempts. I recently read an interesting article about this, that very often for bridge jumpers who survive, many of them say, the instant
Yes.
that I let go, I realized I wanted to live. And of course, not all of them do. Some of them do, and then it turns their life around and they become, suicide prevention activists or whatever the case may be. It's probably similar, not that mass shootings and suicide are in any way analogous, but I would not be at all surprised if the moment that a shooter starts doing a shooting, they change their mind and or realize that it was a mistake. And I also wouldn't be surprised if they end up taking their own lives because of that realization. We talk about these murder suicide things where it's sort of presumed that the
Right.
shooter goes in planning to also take their own life. Maybe they don't always, but it's that regret that hits the second they open fire, where they say, I can no longer live with myself, and that's why they take their own lives in the shooting.
Yeah, it probably depends on the shooter. But another angle I want to touch on too is, do you feel comfortable talking about this story even? Because I remember after the Parkland shooting, we deliberately chose not to say the name of the shooter,
Yep.
because there's this idea that shooters could be inspired by the attention that they get, sometimes posthumously even by the media after they go on these sprees and kill a lot of people.
Right.
But I mean, there are so few mass shooters out there, and I think we have to get a sense of what is going on inside their heads. And so the only really way to do that is by looking into the specific shooters. So, I mean, it's like you're solving one problem, or trying to solve one problem, but perhaps you're creating another and causing more mass shootings indirectly. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know either. But we'll see ultimately what happens with the attorney. We'll see what happens with these supposed planned donations. I've been talking for a while about how studies on diet and exercise show that, just mathematically speaking, diet is much more responsible for weight loss than is exercise. And what I mean mathematically is that you can much more easily reduce net calories by reducing the calories that you eat than you can work off calories by exercising. And sort of, if you imagine, how long do you have to exercise to burn 200 calories versus how easily can you avoid eating 200 calories worth of food, right? So we've known that for a while. But there's an interesting new study published in Diabetes magazine, or the journal Diabetes, which involved animals, but it appears as though it could also be applied to exercise in humans. And what the study looked at is exercise and weight loss among people and animals. And what it found was that exercise in and of itself is not an effective way to lose weight, but it doesn't mean what I said in terms of the balance between diet and exercise. What it points out is that in most experiments that were done, participants lost less weight than would have been expected mathematically, given the number of calories they were burning in their workouts. So it's sort of hard to separate this from what I said before about you can much more easily avoid eating 200 calories than you can burn 200 calories. What the study found is, even when burning 200 calories by exercising, the amount of weight that we would anticipate would be lost by burning the 200 calories seems to be smaller than the amount of weight not gained or lost by avoiding the consumption of 200 calories. I really don't know, Pat, whether I'm doing a good job of explaining this, but I think the idea is that diet is an incredibly important part of weight loss, and that exercise is important for fitness, but that as a weight loss tool, it is not as important as some people make it out to be.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, after you exercise, you often get hungry too. So, say you burn off 200 calories, you're going to be starving afterwards. And so you'll probably eat something that could surpass 200 calories, and then, you didn't really lose any weight after that. And the other reason too is, I mean, if you, let's say you go on like a 2-mile run or something like that, you may get sore. You're probably going to be sedentary afterwards, so you may decide to just chill out for the rest of the day and watch television instead of like going for a walk or doing things that would also burn calories just at a slower rate. So I think that in part has to do with why exercise isn't as efficient. Obviously, there are some benefits when it comes to weight loss and exercise. Like, I think it does speed up your metabolism. But if you're just going for pure weight loss alone, the most effective and the easiest thing really is just to eat less. And, that can be hard for some people, certainly.
Yeah,
But I
so
think
I
I
mean, I
think it
guess
is
that would be
easier than going out and exercising.
I don't know if everybody would agree that the easy thing to do is to just eat less. I mean, I think a lot of people definitely struggle with that. But I think that your point about the sort of relative efficiency of it is one that has been replicated in study after study.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, you ever run on a treadmill and you
sure.
go for like a 2 mile run or something and you see the amount of calories you burned, it's probably something like 200 to 250 calories. That can be pretty daunting to people because 250 calories is like a bag of potato chips. It's not that much food. So I think someone who's trying to lose weight could go for that 2 mile run on a treadmill, exert all this energy, try so hard to get there, and then they think, wow, that's all I burned, 200 calories. That's like the amount of a granola bar or something. And then
Yeah.
they could lose interest and be demoralized and not try as much anymore.
Well, to segue from diet to cannabis, which can sometimes make people very, very hungry, I want to talk about former Speaker of the House, John Boehner. John Boehner was Speaker of the House from 2011 to 2015, and he has changed his view on marijuana legalization. He said yesterday on Twitter that, where he follows me, by the way, that my thinking on cannabis has evolved. He previously said many, many times that he was completely opposed to the legalization of marijuana. And now he says that he has a different view, that it is time for a shift in federal marijuana policy. He believes that cannabis needs to be descheduled, meaning not scheduled as a Schedule 1 drug, so that research can be done, veterans can be helped. We have a number of studies that show that cannabis legalization is hugely beneficial when dealing with the opioid epidemic. So I mean, listen, I saw Boehner more of as a pragmatist than an ideologue. Now, I don't mean that he wasn't an ideological right winger, but what I mean is that I always felt that part of his being an ideological right winger was political posturing rather than his personally and sincerely held beliefs. That doesn't make them any better. They are just as damaging. When a politician says they're anti-gay to raise money rather than because they actually are anti-gay, it's not really any better, right? So it's not a defense of John Boehner. But what I am saying, Pat, is that I'm not that surprised that now that he's freed from the depraved constraints of the political system we have, I'm not that surprised that he's saying something like this.
I'm also not surprised because he's accepting money for working as an advisor to a marijuana company. So,
Right.
that always helps a little bit too. And
Sure.
the
Softens the
impetus
blow.
for changing his mind, so he claims, was that he had a friend who had back pain, and the friend started using cannabis, and apparently it helped him a great deal. And that, for Boehner, was a realization for him that, oh, this can actually help people. And it seems like with Republicans, they always have to see it firsthand. Like, Rob Portman, the senator from Ohio, he wasn't in support of gay marriage until he found out that his son was gay. It's like, why
Right.
does it have to impact you personally for you to come around to the right position? Don't you realize, can't you use a little bit of empathy to understand that other people are experiencing this too?
Absolutely. And when we did the Pat Robertson clip yesterday, where Pat Robertson just seemed perplexed, like only a couple percent of the population is LGBT. Why is everybody making all these changes, even though most people aren't LGBT? Well, some people have empathy and they understand that we can do things to help others that don't necessarily directly benefit us. Although I would argue that it benefits us broadly speaking societally. Yeah, I wish that. I still like it when a right winger changes their mind on a social position,
Right.
because they change to the correct position. But I wish it didn't take knowing someone personally in order to say, oh, actually, maybe I should revisit my position. But I'll take it either way.
Yeah, and another thing about this is that John Boehner is a chain smoker. That's well known. I know when
Yeah.
Paul Ryan took over as Speaker of the House, he waited like a few weeks until the office was fumigated before he moved in there because it just reeked of tobacco.
Yeah.
Guy's used to smoking. I wonder if instead of regular tobacco, he got a little bit of that wacky tobacco and decided
Yeah.
to change his mind just because of that.
I wouldn't be at all surprised. I would not be at all surprised if that was the case. All right, John Boehner, yes, because he's a lobbyist now. Yes, because he's out of office and no longer raising money for re-elections, but he at least has taken the correct position on cannabis legalization. We will follow it. That's it for today's bonus show. Brand new program tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.